right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to my podcast today. My name is Bree Talby. I'm a senior, and I'm a professional selling major. To get into my project for Comm 322, I've decided to do a podcast, obviously. And today we're going to be looking at HBO's The White Lotus. Season 2, Episode 5, specifically. Now, if you're not familiar with The White Lotus, all I can say is get familiar. My main point today, I just want to show kind of how this show in particular uses money and status to shape how characters see themselves. And also, I'd like to expose a little bit of that unfair class divide. To explain this, I will use concepts I've learned in class, like cultural capital, parasocial relationships, representation, ideology, and encoding and decoding. To start with cultural capital, which is basically the idea that things like taste, education, things like that act like social currency. There's two specific scenes I want to talk about. The first scene is in the dinner scene where Harper confronts Ethan about the alleged cheating. But you'll notice everyone else around them is performing. Well, they're not performing. They're just being normal. They're acting civilly. They're just eating their food. There's fancy music and everyone's acting kind of fancy and whatever. So they're definitely, it's almost like a spotlight of them, or a stage, you could say. Whereas everyone else is just kind of amongst their wealth and their own insecurities to notice. The next scene I want to talk about is the opera scene. So on the surface, it probably just looks like it's a really awesome, part of Italian culture. And it looks really high class and awesome. But the reality is, it's really just for rich tourists. That is the only reason they would put on this. It's a moneymaker. This shows how cultural capital isn't just about enjoying the culture. It's reinforcing that class and leisure for the wealthy. And it continues to do that. So you'll notice at a lot of events that the White Lotus ventures off into, you're not going to find a lot of low-income families there, is what I mean by that. So both scenes show how cultural capital is performed and consumed, keeping the classes divided. When I say classes, I mean like upper middle class, higher class, lower class, etc. Now I want to get into parasocial relationships and representation. So, I got to talk about Tanya. Tanya is obsessed with these ideals of love and wealth. She's very much romanticized her life. She's basically shaped by her parasocial relationship with cultural stories about femininity. She relies on a lot of fairy tale like ideals. When I say fairy tale, I mean like social media. Social media can often be perceived as living your best life, but really it's just the best life that everyone wants you to see. This also shows how parasocial relationships can influence how people identify, as how they express themselves, and we'll see that a lot in Tanya. In contrast, Lucia and Mia, they deal with very obvious stereotypes as sex workers, especially in a higher class elite space. Their storyline pretty much just goes to show how marginalized identities like sex workers or hookers or escorts, whatever you want to call it, how that's so easily stereotyped and how it's performed. And I think Lucy and Mia both did a great job. Now, as far as the audience goes, the idea of encoding and decoding from Stuart Hall, the show encodes certain stereotypes, but the audience can decode them in several different ways, including dominant, resistant, and negotiated ways. So for dominant reading, essentially this means the viewer accepts the intended message. For my specific episode, yes, Lucia and Mia, these women, are exactly how sex workers are usually portrayed. So the show is right, because everyone else said that, so why would not be right? Next, we have the resistant. This is where the viewer rejects or pushes back the idea of the intended message. So an example of this would be, this portrayal of sex workers is unfair. It stereotypes Lucia and Mia, and it ignores their entire personality, and they could be a lot more complex if they didn't have that label smacked on them. And finally, negotiated. So this one kind of resonates with me a little bit, with my opinion. A person might enjoy the drama and the storyline, but can still recognize that stereotypes are being enforced about marginalized women, specifically in this episode. But I kind of find that with most shows, especially a lot of shows with pop culture references, you kind of just have to brush off a few. An example I could think of is Family Guy, because there's always several things you kind of have to brush off. So with this, Tanya, Lucia, and Mia all show how TV characters can influence the way people see themselves and others. It also shows how media can reinforce who has power and who doesn't. So yes, Lucia and Mia get to talk to a lot higher class people. Does that make them powerful? I don't know. In conclusion, I want to talk about why this even matters. When we look at the White Lotus and these concepts, we see how this show encodes ideologies of wealth and class, and how audiences decode them in ways that typically reveal inequality. I feel like that's pretty obvious in this show, but this show isn't just for entertainment. It's the perfect example of how identity is performed through money, status, stereotypes, that kind of thing. The White Lotus reminds us that popular culture is never neutral. It is always shaping and reflecting power and inequality and constantly fluctuating. And a lot of times repeating. And that concludes my podcast for today. I hope you enjoyed my enlightenment of this White Lotus episode. It's on HBO Max streaming, and I want to thank you again.